Well, thank you and welcome indeed to everyone, friends and colleagues, people we know from various walks of academic life and time together. This seminar marks yet another collaboration among many between the Scientiae, the association, and the Institute of Philosophy in the Czech Academy of Sciences. And so we are very happy to have designed this, and we hope it will keep us company throughout the semester and through the end of the year. We start today, we finish on mid-December. And I have put in the chat the complete program of the workshop, which takes place every Monday at 4:30 Central European Time. And so you feel free to look at that and download it if you can access to it, so you have a more sense of what's coming up. And ideally, so today I'll make some presentation, and I am in Turin, and then next week we'll do the other way around, and so the virtual hosting will be in Prague, and that's why it is the Turin-Prague seminar. And the idea was really for us to focus on history of scholarship as symbolized, epitomized by various practices like chronologies, for example, but also genre such as the storia literaria or commonplacing and other such activities. So there is a mix, I think, for everyone. There's something about instruments, something about cosmology, something awfully of interest for students of world history and so on. I'm very happy to start today also with a personal friend of mine, and so to introduce to you Barbara Bienias. She holds a PhD in British literature and currently works as an assistant professor at the Institute for the History of Science in the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw. She's an expert of early modern England, particularly the discourses of astronomy and astrology, as well as epistemology, and also a strong interest in manuscript studies, communication, and semiotics of culture. At the moment, she's co-editing, preparing a first critical edition of Edward Gresham Astrosterion of 1603, little known and overly Copernican English astronomical manuscript. And among recent publications, I'd like to mention a couple of articles on Gresham's Astrosterion. One that appeared in 2020 for the British Journal for the History of Science, another which appeared in 2020 as well in Studies in History and Philosophy of Science. I also want to mention the latest publication about prognostication for 1614 in Notes and Queries, and an earlier article as well, The Place of Manuscript Sloan 3703, which appeared in the journal The Library in 2019. And Barbara, apart from this, many prolific side of as a scholar, has also been one of the co-organizers of the Copernican World Congress that took place last year in Poland as part of the celebration of Copernicus, and worked for us at Scientiae in executive capacity in many projects, chiefly as a co-organizer of our annual meeting in 2023 in Prague. And so we are very happy to begin with someone who is well known to us and dear in many ways. And today, she will give us the first paper of the series, which is There is No New Thing Under the Sun, discussing new astronomy in early modern English almanacs. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Stefano, for this very kind introduction. Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. I will start with sharing my screen. Just going full mode. Please let me know if everything works.
Yes.
Yep, you can see everything. That's great. Yep. I'm just trying to minimize my distractions here on the screen. Okay, let's make it start with this. So again, many thanks to Vladimír and Stefano for organizing this seminar and for inviting me to start off this series. It's really a great honor and great pleasure, and I'm so happy to be here. And thank you once again, everyone, for coming. And today I intend to look at how new astronomical ideas, and especially Copernican astronomy, were introduced into popular debate in early modern England in one of the most popular genres at the time, that is the almanac. And the focus is on the discourse around new astronomical ideas regarding the pre-Newtonian system of the world. And in my investigation, I'm going to employ the categories of truth, opinion, and error, which permeated early modern discourse. And the thesis I propose today is that predominantly presenting new ideas was rooted in old patterns, which created a certain epistemic tension or paradox of novelty, if you prefer. And therefore, one of the questions we are going to pose today is how, on the basis of what was known, early modern thinkers established new knowledge. And was it a universal epistemic prerequisite? Also, what was the development of cosmological ideas really linear? What can 17th century views on the frame and fabric of the world tell us about this? And were they really revolutions or rather evolutions or transformations? Some new thoughts on that would be very grateful. And I look forward to your comments and suggestions towards the end. So let us start with the sentiment. And the sentiment expressed in the title that there is no new thing under the sun. Nihil novi sub sole, a biblical phrase which transformed, we find in various also non-theological contexts. In a poem to the reader, Edward Brown states, "Come, there's nothing new. There's nothing spoke that was not spoke before. We are but desperate debtors and restore to present times what we took up on trust from those of former ages and now dust." Similarly, in his ephemerides for 1695, so towards the end of the century, John Gadbury mentions the nihil novi aspect, quoting a Latin sentence from Terence that was employed by many early modern scholars, such as Johannes Jacob Becker or Robert Burton, in the context of the overproduction of books and inability to create new content. Here, the following quote from Chaucer, dubbed an immortal truth: "For out of the old fields, as men say, cometh all this new corn from year to year, and out of old books in good faith cometh all this new science that men learn." Even if there was a reverence for ancient authorities and old knowledge from Chaucer, throughout the 17th century, there was a growing frustration regarding the inability to be truly original. And at the same time, there was a pressing expectation of ingenuity. It was also a kind of modus operandi, which allowed resourcing older material with the growing publication pressure. And at the same time, in order to adapt better, new ideas had to be often introduced through what was already known before. But in dialectical terms, wouldn't new ideas come out of conflicting notions as well? And yet, with that seemingly immutable world, devoid of novelty, discussions of new phenomena emerged, also in theological contexts. Let me give you an example from the sermon on the creation of the Prince of Wales, Henry Frederick, James Stuart's firstborn son. In Daniel Price's sermon, the creation of the Prince of Wales is likened to the first creation of the world. New creations are acknowledged as long as they are God's creations. Other creations of various kinds of dreamers have no consequence. And Price proclaims, this is the text in bold, "Let the astronomers speak of the new stars in Cygno and Serpentario, let the imaginaries find out a new utopia, the cosmographers they new found America. Yet no like news to this, no creation, since the first creation of the world." End of quote. And here, novelty is intertwined with creation, but it can also be associated with discovery and rediscovery, such as experiencing something for the first time. So another pertinent example stems from an engraving titled "The Inventions of Modern Times," which would require a separate lecture and study to cover the richness of this representation. It depicts Amerigo Vespucci observing the Southern Cross with an astrolabe. This plate illustrates Vespucci as the first northerner in the New World to observe the southern stars. An accompanying letter focuses on Vespucci as the first northerner to accept the stars, but before or after only native inhabitants of the land. This suggests that first-time encounter also falls under the category of novelty. Therefore, creation, recreation, discovery, or rediscovery form part of early modern theoretical discourse on novelty. And undoubtedly, the period is abundant in new theory based on new celestial phenomena, new discoveries and new types of observations, which, at least seemingly, change the Aristotelian cosmological framework, such as the new stars of 1572 and 1604, the comets of 1577 and 1585, which helped to discard the concept of solid celestial spheres. Astronomical theories, Copernicus' De Revolutionibus of 1543, Tycho Brahe's geoheliocentric system, Galileo's and Thomas Harriot's first telescopic observations of the moon, or William Gilbert's De Magnete. And then, of course, since the 1640s and 1650s, the breakthroughs and further developments, particularly of the Copernican system, the knowledge of the moons of Saturn by Christian Huygens and Giovanni Domenico Cassini, new observations of comets, and the development of the Copernican, also Keplerian, of course, theory by Ismail Buriot, whose writings, especially his Philolaus and Astronomia Philolaica, were very influential in England in the second half of the 17th century. The idea that the sun is still and the earth revolves around it was referred to as the Copernican paradox, and as I argued elsewhere, was a recurring topic in English literature, almanacs, and manuscript discourse, such as Edward Gresham's Astrostyrian, a critical edition of which is being prepared by Jarosław Podarczyk and myself, a treatise of 1603 which accepts the Copernican system as physically true. In his prognostication for 1607, Gresham, a prominent almanac maker and Jacobean London, defended his views against the critics in the letter to the reader. And I quote, "And so I hear, who, for that I am paradoxal in many things, but especially in the frame and system of the world, differing from all philosophers and divines in that point as they think, absolutely condemn me of atheism and heresy. To these I reply that apostasy from error to truth is no good argument of atheism. In my Astrostyrian, a book I wrote in the heart and heat of the last great visitation, with a reverent reconciliation of the word, with these scrupulous paradoxes, I have neither done injury to God nor nature." End of quote. As demonstrated by Rosamund Colley and Francis Yates, among others, paradox was also generically an inherent part of early modern culture. The notions of truth, opinions, and paradoxes permeated literary and theatrical discourses, famously marked with the works by John Donne or Ben Jonson's Nuptial Masque, Hymenae, in which truth and opinion appear as characters on stage. Or another, Court Masque, which features paradox and obscurity, or further paradoxical examples stating that all things are the best things. So let us now move on to the almanac genre itself. The friction between the old and the new, datum versus novum, analogy is also present in the history of the book and early modern typography. Following in the footsteps of Stephen Orgel, Margareta Di Grazia, and more recently Sean Kalin, let us look at the title page of the 1579 edition of Edmund Spencer's Shepherd's Calendar, a pastoral which incorporates various typographical traditions. With the combination of italic, Roman, and black letter typefaces, the last one being typical of almanacs, at the same time, as Orgel observed, including in the pastoral the calendar image for January, which connects new continental poetry and the most traditional of native forms, something very well known. Kalin stresses that this strategy is a highly effective, semiotized communication based on recognizable signs, some of which have acquired new meanings. And almanacs are precisely that. They are widely popular, the second most published genre except for the Bible in England throughout the early modern period, with the climax of circa 400,000 copies sold yearly during the Civil War. Their omnipresence made them indeed something familiar, something that rehearses and adapts medieval tradition into newer contexts and media, as we see here in the case of the zodiac moon. Or the calendar layout and font, eventually giving more space for readers' engagement. Earlier scholars who analyze astronomical content of almanacs, albeit analyzing only a small fraction of the whole, stated that except for Copernican theory laid out, for example, by Thomas Digges, of which we'll be talking about a bit later, the astronomical content was minimal, increasing towards the end of the 17th century, perhaps, and especially with the development of telescopic observations. And here I'd like to differ a bit and elaborate on this topic. However, already in the pre-telescopic era, almanacs authors responded to new discoveries and theories. For example, in his prognostication for 1607, Edward Pond recounts his observations of the nova of 1604, the same described in the stellar nova by Kepler. I quote, "As of late time, how many terrible and fearful sights have been seen in the heavens, whereof myself with many others have been eyewitnesses. Again, which a strange comet, or rather a new star, did appear unto our observation, anno 1604, seen in the evening in the southwest. The three superior planets, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, being then within less than 6 degrees of the same star, whereof God permitting, I intend to write more at large," end of quote. And such observations were very often followed with the promise of elaborating on a topic in a separate piece of writing, mostly, unfortunately, unfulfilled due to many reasons, especially the problems with finding patronage or money for publication. So with the growing realm of ideas, new discoveries, the discussion of the system of the world, both in astronomical works and popular almanacs, revolves around truth, opinion, and error. And moreover, the discourse in which truth, opinion, and error emerge is facilitated by the growing print market. The presentation of new ideas is fraught with difficulty, as William Gilbert observed in his De Magnete. He questions the necessity of adding to the vast ocean of books that bemuddle and vex the minds of the studios. And this phrase, vast ocean of books, is used in Nicole Howard's recent introductory chapter in Low Print, exploring why scientific authors were reluctant to publish. And fear of scrutiny is one of the reasons. This hesitation is evident in the writings of astronomer and almanac maker Vincent Wing, and in his Harmonicon Celeste, he expresses a reluctance to commit his work to the wide ocean of fluctuating opinions of the public without the protection of an honorable patron. He fears that without such assurance, his work might appear misshapen or monstrous, struggling to escape submersion. And this aquatic metaphor aligns with the quotation from Bacon, who likened time to a river that can sing things of gravity and let the light ones float. But this brings us to Bacon's idea of truth as the daughter of time, which is often revealed, and it comes to light with this very nice imagery connecting the celestial and terrestrial realms over time. However, as we have seen earlier, time can also bury truths embedded in the works that have some weight or significance. How did this pursuit of truth look like in the case of almanac makers? In his brief declaration of the motions of the moon, Edward Pond calls truth the daughter of experience, which here I believe has a slightly different connotation than time, while defending astrology as a legitimate science. He argues that errors lie not in the art itself, but in practitioners who fail to adapt ancient works to contemporary climates through true practice and continual observation. He cites Cyprian, who stated, "Custom without truth is but an old error." Pond admonishes those who mindlessly replicate ancient patterns without adaptation. Without incorporating the necessary changes, the whole reliability of astrology is in jeopardy. So let us analyze some quantitative data. If we take a look at the n-grams for the terms opinion and truth based on the early print database, that is basically the early English books online corpus, some very interesting things happened definitely between 1580s, 1600s, and later in mid-17th century. So exactly in the period we're going to focus on today, the time of some important breakthroughs regarding our understanding of the framework of the world, and also intense debates in England regarding the validity of astrology as a science. Mind you, I'm not building an argument on this data, as much of this is theological discourse regarding religious and philosophical controversies and surely other things. However, these periods marked here in red match the publication dates for the almanacs in which these things also appear. Mind you, almanacs are not among searchable texts in eBay or elsewhere yet, so in order to retrieve this kind of information, you need to refer to physical copies or microfilms. But among 17th century controversies, and as we have already seen, almanac makers had to defend their raison d'être. And one of the ways to do it was to try to scrutinize and preferably eradicate the errors in their profession. In 1603, Edmund Pond, followed by Edward Gresham, but later also Vincent Wing and many others, were pointing out the most serious errors that could be found in almanacs, which related to the errors of calculation, and especially of the eclipses and positions of the planets, but also printing errors and inability to correctly determine the beginning of the year. And here I quote, "Some will not let with rash judgment to condemn almost all arts that extend above their capacity, using for their purpose the abuses in those arts, and thereby abusing the profitable use of them. And to be brief, one principal reason they seem to allege against astronomy and astrology, which is that the professors of those arts do seldom agree in our conjecture, which indeed is too common. Yet that error is not in the art, but in the professor, which, as Mr. Blagrave says, must needs be shameful ignorance, in some of them at the least." And Pond interweaves this with a couplet, a practice we will often observe in almanacs. "A monstrous error lurking in the air have marred the face of all that seemed fair." Towards the end of the century, the sentiment was all still present, with Henry Colley stressing the fact that although to err is human, the fault is often with the professor and not the art. And I would like to turn your attention to the fact that such repetitions of thought among almanac makers are common, when sometimes the words are used verbatim, either because almanac makers knew and resourced their predecessors' work, or because they were all rehearsing a common pool of arguments. For example, Arthur Hopton, in a Correspondency of Years, writes that he plans to draw a book that should solve and correct those uncertain tables, blots to the art and blemishes of the truth, and also wholly to reject any of their methods, drawing forth a work that might instruct the ignorant in the truth, without intricate observations, and satisfies the vulgar without difficult calculations. And similarly, Vincent Wing, 3 decades later, calls such error blots to the art and blemishes to the truth. He continues, "I observed the last year that some of our almanac writers did err from the truth in the changeful and quarters of the moon, sometimes near 30 hours, and seldom come near the truth." To this list of errors, Pond further adds, "Yet another great error there is, which Schoner very well noted, when he said, 'How shall the astrologer avoid an error in judgment, if he be utterly ignorant of the true beginning of the year, the very ground of his prediction?' But how our writers vary in the same is manifestly seen. But ceasing to write all that I pretended, of faults too apparent I wished were amended. Yet of all there can be but one truth. A truth certainly there is, the which myself do labor and study to find, by observation, with sundry instruments, exactly made for that purpose, whereof some have 10 foot semi-diameter, and some less, all which being conferred together with diligence and skill, cannot harbor any error." And Pond, as also George Osborne, as we will see in a moment, wanted to strengthen the truthfulness of the observation through references to the instruments that supposedly guaranteed exact measurements. Edward Gresham wishes more care in the printer in not admitting the unripe fruit of such simple theories to the press, noting that sometimes the printer's fault escaped by transcription without correction. Here we have an example of a manuscript by an anonymous author, possibly a fellow almanac maker or angered user, who compared all the editions of 1628 almanacs and marked the discrepancies in the calculation of the eclipses, as well as the order of the rising of the planets, and the discrepancies in weather observations. And the tables are accompanied by a poem, yet another example of the use of literary discourse in almanacs, in which the author finds them full of errors, absurdities, and stolen material. He ponders on the sources of these mistakes and cannot determine whether the fault lies with the writers or the printers. Due to numerous accusations of this sort, almanac makers felt the urge to defend themselves and their methods. George Osborne, also a skillful instrument maker, writes, "For my labour and pains herein, that thou do not rashly condemn the work before thou hast judiciously observed how I doth cohere and agree with the truth, almost persuading myself that by instrumental observation thou shalt hardly find any sensible error, either in the calculation of the zodiacal planets or in their aspect. Some necessary notes I have inserted, and vulgar errors unfolded, and the whole drawn into such easy and plain method that the meanest capacity may conceive it." As they were writing for a popular reader, while introducing various astronomical phenomena, they had to refer to the concepts that were already known, such as calling the Earth Grand Dame Ops, or still marking that something was in the old sky, that is old dotage, old theory, or correcting the standard revolutions for the seasons with a note that it is in fact not the sun entering Aries, but Earth entering Libra. However, the audience varied, and some almanac makers decided to introduce more advanced tables or calculations, for example, from the Prutenic tables based on Copernican theory or the Tychonic tables. These were usually presented back to back without the authors determining which system or calculation was better. So whenever they did take sides and chose Copernicanism, the idea was to present it as a system which is not contradictory to the Bible, as no new opinion, and devised according to the former doctrines. And here I quote from Wing, that the sun is the center of the visible world is no new opinion, for it is well known that the Pythagoreans and Italian philosophers held the motion of the earth and other planets about the sun. And it is very probable that Pythagoras himself, as some of the most learned think, had the whole philosophic Kabbalah of the creation communicated to him by some knowing priest or philosopher in the Oriental parts. And this also our famous countryman, Mr. Henry Moore, conceives and very learnedly demonstrates in his Conjectura Kabbalistica, which was published in London in 1653. And indeed, he does mention that. And he also refers to the accommodation principle, saying that scripture speaks not as the most learned divines conceive according to the exact curiosity of truth. And this is a very curious phrase itself, describing things kaphupotazin, according to the very nature and essence of them, but kai emphapoi, according as they appear to sense and the vulgar opinion. And Wink presented this opinion already in his Harmonicon Celeste, a much more elaborate work on astronomy. As a side note, this particular passage was plagiarized by Nicholas Greenwood in his Astronomica Anglicana 20 years later, or even later than that. And it's no new opinion, but a hidden truth, terra movere solem et celum stare. Many may think it's a mere fiction we go about to establish, but they will be of my side and will then understand the former error and may discern the fallacy of the Ptolemaic system and the absurd supposition of his followers. But Aristarchus Samius conceived the true type thereof and drew the real image of the visible world, with whom Pythagoras and many others in those pristine times agreed. On top of the methodological errors that almanac makers self-consciously noted, there were errors in judgment in terms of new cosmology and the system of the world, which were first to be corrected by a paragon of a Copernican, Thomas Digges, mathematician, astronomer, and statesman. On the 1566 edition of the Brev, which he possessed, he wrote that vulgar opinion is mistaken, and in 1576 published a treatise titled The Perfect Description of the Celestial Orbs, which was appended to his father's immensely popular but thoroughly geocentric Prognostication Everlasting. The text, which presented the first augmented translation of fragments from Book 1 of the Revolutionibus into English, also contained one of the most known cosmological diagrams, which in fact differed from what was the original Copernican diagram, which we here see both in manuscript on the left, now at the Jagiellonian Library in Krakow, and as printed in the first Nuremberg edition of the Brev on the right. The unbounded sphere of the fixed stars appeared as a consequence of the observations of the parallax of the new star in 1572, which meant that stars had to be much further from us than initially conceived. Dix writes that the Copernican system is philosophically truly averred, which, as Dennis Danielson has proposed, means that it was truly, truly true. Danielson and also Nick and Boris Jardine have noticed that Dix's diagram is a hybrid, a form of bricolage, as in the depiction of the Earth. It includes the globe of celestial elements, water, earth, air, and fire, derived from the Aristotelian cosmos. If we take a look at this particular diagram, we know that it might have been based on something even more familiar at the time. Some of the already published geocentric models, as in this case, perhaps derived from Cornelius Valerius's De Sphera. In a paper that I'm currently working on, I argue that both Dix's translation of the Earth and this cosmological diagram influenced other almanac makers in England, such as Gresham, Thomas Bretnor, or Arthur Hopton. Nevertheless, this was not the only known reference published in England, especially since the 1640s and 1650s publications of Gassendi's works, the Galilean model, already with Jupiter's moons, prevailed. It is explicitly mentioned by Henry Moore, who even gives a reference to the page in the Systemata Mundi. And as we are approaching the end, let me focus on one case study, that is, what happens cosmologically in Vincent Wing's writings. Vincent Wing, whom we already mentioned a few times, was a prolific author, the co-author with William Leyburn of Urania Practica and Harmonicon Celeste, two vernacular compendia of new astronomical ideas. Moreover, he wrote ephemerides for 20 years, which were highly praised by John Flamsteed, the first Astronomer Royal, as one of the most exact ephemerides ever produced. He also authored two other works, Astronomia Instaurata of 1656, also in English, and then posthumously published, though in Latin, Astronomica Britannica. And most importantly to us now, a series of almanacs, Uranius Omai and Olympia Domata. In those texts, Wing accuses those who still support the Ptolemaic system, and he thinks this is a commonly received opinion. But it's an erroneous tenet, because the true form of the order and visible world and this true situation of the planetary orbs was already explained by Bourriot, and most recently, this in the same year, by himself in Harmonicon Celeste. And in this work, possibly prompted by various accusations laid against him by Jeremy Shakerley, he indeed presents the system of the world that is based quite loosely on the representation of the Galilean system, with the sphere of stars as presented in Gassendi's diagrams. But this publication in the almanac of the same year, on the right, differs from the one in Harmonicon Celeste. And I don't know why. I mean, it is called the genuine type, referring to the system which is devoid of a multitude of most gross and palpable absurdities. That is, for example, the eccentric circles and so on and so on. It does not have the sphere of the stars at all. And one would think this is because, as it usually happens with popular print, diagrams are simplified or there is a lack of space. However, Wing hastens to explain that he does not know whether the immense vast space, that the last lines on this slide, beyond the orb of Saturn is devoid of stars or not. But by the time he published Astronomia Instaurata 5 years later, he had already known and presented the system with the unbounded sphere of stars, which we remember from Dix's diagram. So further representations of the system of the world, also these post-Newtonian, were further augmented by the presence of comets and new moons. For example, here, the third moon of Saturn, discovered by Cassini in 1672, adding to the common pool of astronomical knowledge. So let me conclude with some final thoughts. First of all, we must remember that almanacs were a genre prone to error, and authors were correctors of others as well. Correcting the error of former opinions seems to have been the epistemic predicament in early modern astronomy and astrology. New ideas were presented either as a continuation of formal traditions, as revived old truths, or as former models believed to be monstrous and absurd. Almanac authors also tried to use language that was suited to the reader. And there is some continuity in cosmographical visual tradition and a tendency for eclecticism and accumulation in presenting new cosmological ideas. Moreover, the popularization of scientific theories, but also the stimulation of this debate, had a significant impact on the spread of new cosmological ideas in England. Translations and vernacular literature were crucial factors in spreading new astronomy during this period. And finally, we must not forget about the interdependence of discourses in creating new scientific arguments in the early modern period. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Barbara, also for keeping perfect time. So we have time for discussion. We can alternatively raise the hand or use the chat. I have a couple of questions, but I will try to keep them for later. So I'd like to first perhaps open the floor and see if there's some comment or questions before. Yeah, let's see. Vladimír, yes.
Yes, thank you so much, Barbara, for such a rich paper. And I have a question which relates to your conclusions a little bit, but goes in slightly different direction. I have somebody in the waiting room, so I have to, okay. You mentioned and discussed this aspect of the whole discussion when the authors of the almanacs were at the same time correctors of the different authors of the almanacs. And I'm just curious whether you also have found a lot of evidence about the marginal notes of not of the authors of the almanacs as who criticized other authors, but of the readers who might correct the mistakes in the copies that they owned. So is there any evidence of this reaction of readership to some mistakes in the almanacs, etc., etc.? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question, Vladimir. Actually, this is something that we've been wondering together with Stephen van der Broeke during our conference in Brussels in June. And we were thinking of whether there are any signs of readership, actually engagement with this kind of errors. And other than any engagement with those most elaborate works, not almanacs themselves, that means the erratas that were published with, for example, Astronomia Instaurata, and then readers correcting some of the errors based on the errata. No, I mean, I have seen a lot of readership signs, markings, but they were rather just underlining something that was perhaps useful. And other like manuscript engagement with almanacs are just personal notes on the blanks. That means this space that is especially that we use in the sense that we use calendars today, like space just devoted to notes. I did not see, unfortunately, maybe somebody has, and that would be very helpful, has seen anyone actually correcting that, other than astrologers perhaps correcting their opponents, let's say, adversaries' works. No, I have not seen any marks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
There is one hand raised. Go ahead.
Did that mean me?
Yes, yes, sure.
Hello.
Hello.
Oh, now you muted yourself. You were muted. You can unmute the microphone and.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Did they use tables or did they use ephemerides in order to compile the almanacs? Because I'd be interested at what stage they discovered that the Rudolphine tables.
They used
Tycho, and of course his portrait is by far the most obvious thing on the Rudolphine tables. I wondered if that meant him.
I believe, I mean, they used ephemerides, but they also simplified them for tables for calculations from themselves. Henry Colley, for example, did that. Other authors did the same. For example, John Gadbury for Argo. They simplified tables also for the use for almanac makers. They recalculated them. That was, as you know, of course, tremendous process, and they hired people to help them do that, because otherwise that would be impossible, of course.
Yeah, it's hard work. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stephen,
Okay, Sergio.
I think Stephen and Sergio, and then yes.
Sergio.
Shall I go first?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, my camera is acting up a bit today. Thank you, Barbara, for the wonderful presentation, as usual. Conceptually very rigorous and very rich in evidence and quite suggestive. I have two questions. One is something you just touched at the very beginning, and is related to my research and has to do with the representation that you find in the almanacs on the Americas, on the meaning of the discovery of the New World. I don't know if you've been a bit over the topic. You mentioned it, and you put the beautiful Vespucci engraving, and I'm curious if you can tell me a bit more about how this is represented in the context of English almanacs, because obviously in Iberian almanacs this is quite epoch making and a very important moment for calendrics and ephemerides. So that's my first question, and the second one has to do, if you can tell us a bit more about these almanacs that begin to portray different systems of calculation. What do you think this is happening? And if in the traces of use, you notice any preference, if there's a tendency on the preference, for example, when the progenic tables are introduced, if this begins to be more interesting, because in the case of Iberian almanacs, they start to appear, the progenic tables, for example, but they are not presented as something different or equivalent, but as something else. I mean, they are presented as part of the exposition, but not as something alternative. So if you can tell us a bit more about that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for this. That is very helpful and very interesting. And thought-provoking. As for Vespucci, no, I have not seen anything reflected in English almanacs, actually, unfortunately. I mean, perhaps something that might recur a bit later on, and this is something that we might talk about, I think, later, towards the end of 17th century, already with colonial almanacs, that I would be very interested to look at this. Not in the first half of the 17th century that I encountered, to my regret. And as for your second question, it's very interesting. I have to think about it a bit more, but my intuition is that at some point, especially if, I don't know, for example, who could that be? People who started to prefer Tycho Brahe's calculations, and that would be especially around the moon, and that would be both Sir Christopher Hayden, for example, and Arthur Hopton. I'm sure perhaps Stephen would be would know more and maybe help me a bit with this. That's something that progenic tables at some point are just believed to be not reliable anymore. And that happens already in early 17th century. And later on, these they recalculate tables that appear later on in Rudolphine tables, based also on Brahe's observations. But then Keplerian tables are adapted also in the second half of the 17th century. Then we have Caroline tables already in England, and they use that. That's what I can say at this point. Thank you. Stephen. So good to see you.
Barbara, nice to see you. Thanks very much for that. And I wanted to jump in on a particular point, a particular slide that you had, really, which was this, and it's a bit of a lazy question, really, because I could just get on my bike and cycle down the hill and go and see the Bodleian manuscript. But I hadn't come across that one that you showed where there was the comparison of
Sorry, I can't hear you well, Stephen. Something with the connection, perhaps? It's my connection, maybe.
Yeah, it appears to be, Stephen, you appear to be
Even
froze.
it froze, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I would suggest that maybe we can try it. Let's do this, Stephen. We come back to you if you have a better connection. Otherwise, try to type something in the chat to let us know you are available still. And yeah, I'm sorry, I must have understood the order differently, but I saw that yeah, you had a question, and Sergio as well, who spoke. So I just taking advantage of this time, I wonder if I could just ask you something myself. So I think you've used a rather strong philosophical sense of the agency of error, lurking in error, and I wonder how much you can construct about this from this in terms of history of ignorance. And I'm thinking specifically of recent publications by Ted, who is in attendance, and also by Vera Keller. In other words, deprogramming Bacon and the history of hints and clues and so on. So how do we square the notion of error, that error contains something philosophically useful, with the negative assessment of utility in the Baconian tradition, such as it was understood for many, many years as having to prove itself useful? And then the other question is also about, do you find any notion of encryption in error? So something that falsifies the truth, either because it's convenient or because of for, again, ignorance. I'm thinking of Kepler in the German translation of the Caelo. He makes the point that Aristotle has misunderstood the pyrocentric Pythagorean model, which is really heliocentric. And so I'm thinking about some debates in Rome, 1540s, and so, where people say this Pythagorean reference is really played in almost as in a doxography, you know? So there are people who claim this is what Pythagoras wanted to say, and it's really the same as heliocentrism, and others say, no, it's pyrocentric, it's not. So there is no geometrical center, is not a cosmological center, and so on. So I wonder, is error a category that we can employ in beyond the errands, like finding, I mean, like in a literary sense, labyrinth of error and so on, but it's also something related to the history of ignorance. That's all.
Thank you very much for this very interesting issue and very interesting question indeed. I've been thinking of error for quite some time, also across discourses. And what I encounter in specifically English context, especially of the late 16th and 17th century, is actually associating error with ignorance. And I'm familiar with Sandrine Paragos' new book on the paradox of ignorance in early modern England and France. And she was trying to show that discrepancy between understanding of ignorance also coming from error and error of judgment as something possibly positive, especially that we see in the early modern French discourse, as opposite to what we see in England, apart from some communities, for example, Quaker communities. But that is in particular to reference to ignorance as something that can have that positive, formative aspect. Whereas indeed, especially around that scientific writings, error and ignorance are paired very often, error of judgment, and they are mentioned in pejorative, negative context. I have not seen many when actually erring can lead to something positive, which is quite striking, because I absolutely take your argumentation of some kind of deconstruction. I'm not saying that what happens perhaps maybe a bit later on, indeed, I mean, towards the end of 17th, maybe 18th century, especially with experimenting at the Royal Society. I would have to look at those sources perhaps once again. It's a very interesting issue indeed. Whether we can think of then errors in experiment as something that can be formative, something that of course later on we know in the 20th century of some kind of mistakes and errors that led to breakthroughs and new inventions. But I'm not sure that they are actually looking at that, especially like late 16th throughout the 17th century, mid 17th century. If somebody has counterexamples, I would be very happy to hear about that. I'm not sure it answers your questions, but with regard to my sources, that's a very interesting issue indeed. Thank you. And your second question. I think it was about the concept of falsifying, like hiding something through error. That's also interesting because when you think of errors, especially in published works, they are referring to something that can come out of misprints, for example, and errors in printing. This is something that was also quite recently taken up by a group of authors on this kind of collected essays on misprinting that included essays by Rich Kramer and Anthony Grafton, for example. They were terrified of errors. I mean, something that can actually alter the meaning. But they allowed, and this is something that I talked about with some people who deal with also history of astronomy, especially at the Paris Observatory, that there is something connected with the error being inherent in our epistemic abilities. I mean, they were trying to show that error is something that we have to take into account when we are approaching not only text but anything in forming new knowledge, which would also show that they were so accustomed to living with error that they were also to find errors and to overlook them, not only because of the erratas, but because some of the readers, for example, were so capable of correcting errors themselves. And although the authors were afraid of judgment and scrutiny, so something that we also saw in almanac makers, that you commit so many errors, that you make so many mistakes, I believe that they also were accustomed to error to a point where it was part of this kind of paradigm of getting through reading, getting through knowledge, for producing knowledge. So on the one side, there was like a threat of error. Then on the other side, they were absolutely accustomed to it. Not sure if it answers your question.
No, thank you. It was very rich. I propose we go back to Steve, and if you are now in a position to complete your question.
Yes, and after Steve, Veronica expressed the wish to ask the question.
Great. Thanks very much. I don't know whether Zoom threw me out or my connection broke. Not quite sure, but anyway, I'm back again. And I don't know how much I managed.
I mean, you asked about this manuscript that you can actually see just writing your wife down to
yeah. But I was very struck by that because it seemed to me to be very unusual to have.
It is very unusual. I mean, I've never seen anything like that before.
Yeah.
Somebody comparing, editions from the same year.
And the thing I was curious about was, as far as you can tell, is that a comprehensive review of English almanacs for that year, or is it more broadly based? Is it looking at ones printed on the continent?
Only English almanacs.
Okay.
Only English almanacs, but he's interested in the tables, especially the eclipses, the calculations of the eclipses, then the rising of the zodiacal planets, and the weather predictions for that. These are the main areas that he's interested in, those comparisons. What you could see probably, maybe now, I don't know if I can get back to that slide. I will try, just give me a moment. I want just to show you one thing. Can you see the slide?
Yeah.
Okay, can you see that when he compares them, and Osborne is the one also that was an instrument maker from Hull, something that we might talk about, I think, later on. You see that when he's the most precise, not necessarily correct, but you can actually make a lot. And also, I think from other tables, you can try to think of who was copying from whom at some point. So this is something that definitely, I think, I would like to have a closer analysis of as well.
Yeah, very. I mean, it is a wonderful find, that, I think, just for giving a sense, because typically what we have there is a lot of sort of rhetoric about correction and getting things right, and the inadequacies of everybody else, but to have that sort of detailed comparison does suggest a slightly different engagement with those texts. So I mean, I think you said that it's anonymous. Or the author.
It's anonymous. I mean, I couldn't find any reference. There are other things, mostly by the same hand, but there are different hands in that manuscript. Also on the art of dialing, something that we might also discuss maybe later if you're interested. Because maybe that would also give us some hints on who that possibly was.
Yeah, well, I mean, roundabout, I mean, a number of people I can think of who are doing things like dialing, but are doing other stuff too, that might be interesting to look at a bit harder. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
May I? Thank you, Barbara, for your wonderful, rich talk. You've mentioned, or you've also placed in your conclusion slide, the important role played by the translation and adaptation, and also given that almanacs were such a compilatory, eclectic genre. So I'm wondering if you could tell us more about the strategies of translation and adaptation, specifically on using the example of the corpus that you have worked with.
Okay, thank you very much for this, Veronica. Well, with this translation, I mean, already in historiography we have a rich discussion of how he translated his Copernicus and how he included these passages from the Revolutionibus. The technique is that of augmentation. I mean, that apart from being also not very literal with some passages, but also adding some new parts to that. But when we think of other authors, and then, for example, I'm thinking now of later 17th century, this is George Wharton, who published passages on, for example, 12 houses in astrology, in the zodiacal chart. Then they were taking, for example, French texts, and they were adapting them, and then the translation was quite literal, what I can say. So whenever they thought that there is something about the method, this is my impression of what I've seen, they were trying to be rather exact. And this is, for example, also the whole program of the translations from and initiated by the Society of Astrologers and also Elias Ashmole. How they were trying to introduce, and for example, Shakerley was translating Tetrabiblos. I have not seen those texts, and of course, I don't have faculty to compare or to analyze them philologically. But then, of course, there were also translations from Guido Bonatus by Henry Colley that were published later on. And also translations of Latin texts, because they were trying to make this whole astrological program going on in the second half of the 17th century. But they were really trying to translate as much as possible. That was this methodological program of bringing, first of all, the old astrology back into, and also to legitimize the science, and also to put as much as possible in the vernacular, simply for the bigger community to be able to acknowledge the true essence and the true nature of astrology as well. But there's also translations of almanacs themselves, and this is something that I've been taking a look at, especially about the predictions or strange news from other lands that were translated into English. I have one example. I can't really recall now the author. I'm sorry, the French author. And there is an anonymous translation. Sometimes, of course, when you translated words from French or from continent, you had to be anonymous in those translations. And the translation of the text proper of this prediction of some ominous things that are going to happen around, I think, 1604 is literal. But there are some liberties taken with other aspects of the translation just to accommodate it to it. This technique is called in translation domestication. So they were trying to make it more suitable for the English context. And of course, when you have translations of ancient authors, or even not that ancient, but let's say some predictions from, let's say, 10 years or 20 years before, when you edit or adapt that text, you will, of course, omit the predictions for example, 1620 when you are in 1645. You will just omit those parts that are not relevant to present times. That also refers to simply editing text from manuscript of other authors that wrote, for example, in English. I hope it answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you for introducing this array of rich practices. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I suppose we have a couple of extra stray minutes if someone wants to make a further question or brief comments. Of course, we have to be brief to wrap up as close as possible to the hour. But of course, Barbara, you've given such a wonderful panoramic answer. So that's Sergio, please.
Thank you very much. I want to jump quickly on to elaborate on a question you asked, Stefano. Is about the errors, about the not only the meaning of the errors, but the use of errors. How different almanac makers promote that their almanacs are better than the previous one, that they correct the errors that the previous did. But in the case of Spanish almanacs, not normally this is not necessarily a technical improvement. Sometimes it's just a different setup of the same information, or there's not an entirely new calculation, but just reorganization of some data in a way that is more useful because it was difficult in the previous one, but it's not necessarily an error. But they sell it as an error sometimes. So I'd like to know in your case, in the case of English almanacs, how you see this case.
Well, sometimes they accuse themselves of something, for example, of plagiarism or just errors in judgment that actually do not happen. This is also true. I mean, that they say that they are introducing some new data, or that they are borrowing from others, but actually it does not happen. But they introduce the new writings as such, as in opposition to somebody who is apparently worse than they are in their art and science. But I can't really think of like one particular example now when they say you erred in this. I imagine that sometimes when they do that, they err themselves. I mean, the accusations of errors of others may be also miscalculation on the part of somebody who is an accuser in that case. And there are things like that. Usually the calculation of tables. Sometimes the errors already are believed to be not accommodating to the needs of the readership. So it means that somebody created a table, for example, of when to go to court. So the tables of returns and assigned days, for example. And then we know, I mean, this is also maybe they're like looping to Vladimir's question about any signs of readership. They are silent. I mean, there are letters to the readers. And then sometimes almanac makers reply to something that I imagine they received as feedback. So one of the feedback was, I heard that you don't understand. the tables are too complicated, for example. And they want to correct this. And then they kind of make self-corrections. So they change, but it does not necessarily has to be any factual error, let's say.
Thank you so much.
Well, it's hard to interpret the silence, but perhaps it's time to wrap. We will envelop our own history of reading, continuing with a very similar topic next week, where Vladimír will be the host, at least virtually in Prague. So we will be talking, and we will be hearing a talk by Sergio on almanacs in the Ibero-American early modern world. Thanks for all of you for being with us. And I hope to see all of you and many more next time. And thank you to Barbara for a wonderful presentation, very rich, very, very deep, and also for your interesting questions and, the making yourself available to all of us. And it was wonderful to see you all. I don't know if Vladimír, you want to say a few words, otherwise we can conclude the session.
Well, I can only thank all of you for being with us, and it was an excellent paper. I'm looking forward for the continuation of our series, and as Stefano said, I will be hosting the next session from Prague. So have a nice week.
if I just might add to the end, I mean, thank you once again for this opportunity. Thank you to everyone in the audience, for you, Vladimír and Stefano, for convening this seminar. I look forward to everyone else's talks and to many discussions in the future. If you'd like to reach me, I hope my email is somewhere available on the Scientiae list as well. So do be in touch. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Barbara.
Okay, bye-bye then.
Bye-bye. Have a lovely afternoon, evening, or morning.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Goodbye, everyone.